our featured speaker, Martin Luther King III, and we'll kind of roll on from there. So obviously, this is one of the few speakers I get to introduce who actually needs no introduction. Everybody knows who Martin is. One of the leading human rights activists, not just in the country, but in the world. He's active promoting human rights and peaceful social change in countries all over the globe. As you know, he is the son of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, two of the country's great social change icons. And he's here to talk to us today about doing good in the 21st century. So without further ado, we're going to turn the podium over to Martin Luther King III. Please give him a welcome.
Good morning. I hope everyone had an opportunity to have great rest. And I am certainly honored to be back in Rhode Island. And I certainly want to thank Eric and Linda and the entire team that is responsible really for calling us together to enhance what not just is good, but how we create good in our nation and world. So the basic themes of this gathering certainly are consistent with those ideals that shape the vision and strengthen the resolve of my father and his team during the modern civil rights struggle of the last century. They include a life of purpose must include pursuing a good greater than ourselves. This idea of a greater good embraces the public good in the sense of a shared experience, not only in time and space, but also an opportunity. Even more, it includes bettering the lives of others in a non-collective way. Thus, individual acts of love or caring and ethical conduct of business are important ways to contribute to and advance the greater good. But so too is public policy. Now, in short, anyone in any field, commerce, charity, art, or science, governing or holding a government accountable, can and therefore should contribute to the greater good. Indeed, it is truly the responsibility of every citizen. Now, this raises the question, what is the greater good? My father would no doubt answer this question using the language of the beloved community. His dream that one day this nation would rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed was a dream of the greater good. Certainly, as Eric has reminded us, the greater good must be advanced in the private sphere as well as the public, because we've seen a fraying of the public spirit over the last 50 years. Now, I say this mindful that next year marks the 50th anniversary of my father's assassination. Indeed, I'd argue we've never seen the public spirit as low as it now is perceived. And if we don't rise up as concerned citizens, we are likely to see it weaken even further in the years ahead. Now, in that vein, one of the things that my father taught us was that it only takes a few good women and men to bring about change. The modern civil rights movement, it really was not the masses of people. Yes, we saw the Great March on Washington where over 250,000 came. We saw a significant march from Selma to Montgomery, not the march itself, but when my father and his team arrived in Montgomery where over 10,000 were there. But most campaigns were probably less than 100 people. but dramatic change was made throughout our nation. Now let me switch back, because this point was amplified over the past 48 hours by our immediate past two presidents, both President Barack H. Obama and President George W. Bush. With the unprecedented break in tradition, they have both spoken out against the vitriol that mires the current presidency. They each, and without coordination, decry the politics of division, the cruelty that stands in stark contrast to civility in our national dialogue, and the bigotry of naivism that masquerades in the guise of nationalism and is vainly veiled in the tragic cloak of America First. We heard last night how government itself is changing to meet technological challenges and seize technological opportunities. And we'll hear today how these challenges will further change the landscape of this century, and what many people, including several in this room, are doing in response to advance the greater good. What I'd like to address briefly this morning is the lessons of the past to advance that greater good. Particularly, I'd like to highlight briefly those lessons my father's teachings give us, and see how they might be applicable to a new era, to pass the torch, in a way, to the new generation gathered here. Of course, my father is associated in most minds with the modern civil rights movement. This was indeed his concern from the outset of his 13-year campaign. But as his work grew, so did his understanding of what the greater good truly means. For a while, he addressed domestic issues around civil and human rights. In the latter part of his life, he talked about the Vietnam War and the immorality of that war. As he became head of what would become the most important social and political movement in American history, he worked against the injustices of power. Soon, the range of his voice would expand to challenge not just America's system of legal apartheid, but also the injustice of its use of force to impose that will abroad. Thus, he would declare injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In this truth lies the greater good of civility and community. His concern was for the greater good of all humanity. So he argued that we live in an interconnected world. That which affects one person directly affects all persons indirectly. That means what affects one community or group of people affects all communities and groups of people. Often he said, I can't be what I ought to be until you're what you ought to be. You can't but be what you ought to be until I'm what I ought to be, because our destinies are tied together. As he identified with the anti-war movement, he opposed that Vietnam War similar. He understood that poverty is a malady of the whole community. And thus the last campaign that he was planning before his death was the Poor People's Campaign. The idea was to bring together poor blacks and poor whites and poor Native Americans to go to Washington and really demand equal pay for equal work. In fact, he was talking about a living wage in 1967. And here we are in 2017 attempting to get the minimum wage moved to a higher level. We've done it in some states, but still have a long way to go. But think about that. He was talking about a living wage in 1967. He saw these issues, civil rights, economic rights, and human rights, as interrelated. Their denial constituted what he called the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. What we might see in this today is the interrelated challenges of cultural attitudes hardened into institutions and structures, power grown unchecked into force, and commerce converted into inequality. One of my associates and close friends, and actually president of an organization that I work with, Dr. Johnny Mack, I like to hear how he frames these issues as culpability, bigotry, and violent rivalry. This means there's work for each of us to do in each of these areas. In the cultural realm, in the political realm, in the economic realm. Whether your field of study and eventually destination in life is the arts, public policy, or finance, or anything else, you have a role to play in advancing the greater good. I like to call this greater good a culture of nonviolence. The question is, will you? Let me share the example of how my father approached this work for good in all of these realms. He started his education in the social realm through the critical tradition, studying theology and philosophy, and ultimately working to reach people's souls. This brought him into the political realm, working to reach people's thinking. He understood that if we can change the way we think, then we can change the way we act. Thus, eventually, he would focus on the marketplace, trying to change people's actions. Let me stress again, each of these seemingly different realms were interconnected. They were also multifaceted. As a religious leader, he preached and taught, but he was also a man of action. Perhaps ironically, because he was a man of words. Thus, when the Montgomery bus boycott began, almost organically, he, as a young preacher, was asked to lead it because of his dynamism in the pulpit, not activism in the streets as of yet. But this also brought him within the very quarters of power, of the power he marched against. Thus, he was famously working where possible and necessary with President Lyndon Johnson and other government leaders to bring about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and posthumously, the 1968 Fair Housing Act. These are laws that permanently changed the face of America and affirmed the greater good. Ultimately, he realized that it wasn't enough to challenge the pillars of power through the direct action of resistance and protest. This kind of action, though necessary, can not only ensure the greater good, one must also question the social edifice itself, including the entire structure of social injustice. That means working on the economic relationships that shape the daily lives of every one of us. He worked to challenge the very structures themselves, especially the relationships in a capitalist economy between workers and those who employ them. When he was killed nearly 50 years ago, he was marching in Memphis with the sanitation workers to encourage, again, a living and decent wage for those sanitation workers. Today, just about 50 years later, I asked myself, what would my father question about the current state of affairs? And what should we be doing to create the greater good? The answer comes in another question. That is the title to his last book that he wrote, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? In one important sense, he argued we must answer that question with the same critical thinking on nonviolence, or we may risk non-existence. When we do this thinking, we find that nonviolence is more than protest and resistance. And it requires everyone in every segment of society to do its part: civil society, the political class, and the market sector. And where do we go from here? He defines the social edifice as the world house. And in this house, we must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools. Thus, its less fortunate and marginalized occupants of all races, religions, and ethnic backgrounds are demanding their voices be heard, their faces seen, and their needs met. Indeed, what is behind many of today's protests of the left and the right demonstrates this point. People have lost confidence in the social edifice, the institutions that mediate their life chances, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. For too many, the American dream is decidedly a nightmare. Rather than taking on the failed structures and those accountable for them, too many have turned on each other. But hate and darkness only bring more hate and darkness. And violence only brings more violence. He said, darkness cannot put out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot stamp out hatred, only nonviolence and love can. So nonviolence, however, provides the way to resolve our differences without causing hurt or harm to one another. But just as nonviolence is more than reframing from physical hurt and harm are more than physical violence of brute force. They are also the structural violence that denies a child adequate food and shelter. They are the institutional violence that withholds from our youth first-class education and training that prepares them to make a living. And they are the cultural violence that denies a whole community the opportunities to realize their full potential. Whether that group is African American, white American, or any other person of so-called color. My father was acutely aware of these stark realities. He saw the need for a social change strategy that would produce a culture of nonviolence. This brings me to the issue of social activism, known as direct action. For it is true that Martin Luther King Jr. viewed nonviolent direct action as the most powerful tool African Americans had at that time to address their situation of institutional discrimination and oppression, whether de jure or de facto. It would provide the means for the nation to come to grips with the inconsistencies between the promise of its constitutional commitment and its behavior towards its non-white citizens, primarily, though not exclusively, those of African descent. But mere awareness, however important, would certainly not be enough. While the movement saw important changes, arguably directly attributable to nonviolent direct action, my father came to realize it would not be sufficient to bring about a full transformation of the social structures that unduly and unfairly limit the life chances of some groups while favoring others. He realized that if nonviolence is to be truly relevant in this century, then it must be effective for use in all cases of violent conflict, whatever the form of violence. He saw this idea is only realizable when nonviolence is infused as values within the social structures. This infusion is what he called a revolution of values. Such values are those that foster human dignity, liberty, and community. They are the values that infuse the greater good. This infusion means these values must be evident in our direct action and interaction with one another. They must be evident in the systematic institutions that give order to and mediate our interaction, whether they are political, social, or economic. And they must be present in the cultural justifications that mediate our collective interaction. This is not nonviolent resistance, but it is nonviolence, and it does resist the culture of violence infused in the current social edifice that produces poverty, bigotry, and violent rivalry. Martin Luther King Jr. called these the triple evils of our society. Thus, this is the challenge of today. This is the call of the greater good. It is a call for human dignity, civility, and community. Now comes the question, will we answer that call? Will you answer that call? I started off by saying that it only takes a few good women and men to bring about change, and my father and his team showed us that through an instructive model that was utilized during the modern civil rights movement. So as I close, let me share these final words. My mother took me to her undergraduate institution in Yellow Springs, Ohio, Antioch College. And on that college, there was a statue of the educator, Horace Mann. And under that statue was an inscription that perhaps has made an indelible impact upon my life. I think I was probably about 14 years old when I saw that statue of Horace Mann. And what the words said were, "Be ashamed to die until you've won a victory for humanity." And as I thought about that, I said, my goodness, that's a very powerful and grandiose statement. Be ashamed to die until you've won a victory for humanity. But then I began to break it down. I said, we can win victories on our streets or in our neighborhoods. We can win a victory in our school. We can win a victory in our places of worship. Some of us may win victories in our cities. Some may win victories in our state. Some may win victories in our nation, and yet still some may win victories for our world. What those words mean, though, are be ashamed to die until you've done a little something to make the world in which we all must live a little better than it was when you arrived. Thank you, and God bless you.